All right, welcome back for our second part of today's or this week's lessons. This is lesson 32.2b, Japan's Pacific Campaign, part two, namely where we look at America's entrance into World War II and how we, the United States, and our allies go on the offensive. Now, keep in mind, by offensive, I don't mean like, oh, this person said a bad word, they're being offensive. Be more offensive the way that you would mean in sports, right? Whatever team has the ball, whoever's trying to score, they're on the offense. Whoever's trying to stop them is on the defense. So that's what we mean by America on the offense. Where have we been? Last week we spoke about the motivations for Japan's empire in Asia. You can remember them trying to get their natural resources, trying to extract those so they can continue their fight in China, especially their interests in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the Philippines, Thailand. The list goes on and on and on, along with their interest in taking over the islands of the Pacific. We also looked at why Japan attacked the US in Pearl Harbor. Remember, it's not that Japan wants to start a fight with the US. They know they cannot win a long war with the US. What they want to do is deliver the US a strong punch to try to get the US to at least negotiate with Japan so that they can keep getting those resources in Southeast Asia. Otherwise, they would be afraid that the US would keep trying to stop them. And that leads us to point three, which was we also saw how the U.S. was drawn into World War II. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States then declared war on Japan. When they did that, we also declared war on Japan's allies, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. So now the U.S. is at war. Now the U.S. is in World War II. Today, we're going to see how the United States and its allies in the Pacific begin to strike back. We're going to look at that in two ways, actually. We're going to look at the early phases of the American offensive in the Pacific, which I shouldn't even call it the offensive. It's more like the defensive phase, right? Like the United States is still being attacked by Japan. Japan is still very much on the offensive in the first part of this lesson. But by the second half, you'll see how the U.S. starts to push back. And that brings us to the second point, where we are going to describe and understand, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to do these two things, describe and understand the experience of the American strategy of something called island hopping. All right, so let's take a look at America Strikes Back, that first objective. And like I said, it's really only kind of. First thing, Pearl Harbor was in December. Months go by. 5 months, 6 months go by before the U.S. Does anything to strike back at Japan. Americans were demoralized. Americans were taken by surprise. This was a shock to a lot of Americans. And morale was low, meaning Americans didn't believe America could win this war. Americans believed that they were going to lose a conflict in the Pacific. And so there was one attack called the Doolittle Raid. Now, the Doolittle Raid, its whole point isn't necessarily to cause a lot of damage. You'll see over here, they don't actually damage a lot of Japan. They do very little damage, actually. But what these airplanes do is they take off from these aircraft carriers, and they were their plan was to fly over Japan, drop a few bombs over Tokyo, and then because they wouldn't have enough fuel to come back, just go ahead and crash land in China. Okay, I mentioned not a very destructive attack. Why was this still important? Well, it raises morals in the US. It shows, hey, look, we can win. We can punch back. We are recovering. And soon, not yet, in fact, not for another year almost, we are going to go on the offensive. But for now, look, Americans are still in this fight. We're not defeated. There are some people who claim that Japan, or some Japanese people, were also shaken by this. Having read a lot of the primary sources, I don't think a lot of Japanese people, Japanese soldiers, Japanese generals really thought this was a scary thing. They saw it for what it was. It was the U.S. basically trying to land a punch back to pump up the people at home. But the next month, the U.S. does win a major victory, something called the Battle of the Coral Sea. This is in May 1942. Now we're 6 months away from Pearl Harbor. Um, there's this island called Papua New Guinea. Basically, why it's important is it's pretty close to a lot of important Japanese bases. And the Japanese want to take this base away from the Allies. Okay, so it's just another battle over an airfield. Great. Here's why the Battle of the Coral Sea is so important. This is the first battle where the ships, the aircraft carriers, the battleships, couldn't actually see each other. The Battle of the Coral Sea is important because it is the first example of the type of fighting that you would see all throughout World War II in the Pacific, meaning two fleets of ships hundreds of miles apart, cannot see each other. Um, have their airplanes take off from their aircraft carriers. The other side has their airplanes take off from their aircraft carriers, and they spend months just looking for each other. And when they do find each other, that's when the attack begins. But they're only attacking each other through their airplanes. Never do these battleships, or rarely do these battleships, actually fight against each other in World War II. It's normally done by fighter planes attacking battleships, kind of like in Star Wars. If you ever watched any of the Star Wars movies, you see like all the X-wings come out of the ships, and then the X-wings are the ones going like to do the fighting, or the TIE fighters, whatever. That's basically modeled on this war. The Battle of the Coral Sea is the first example of this type of fighting. Um, Technically, it's true the United States lost more airplanes and more boats than Japan did. But it's still considered a defensive victory because it did force the Japanese to turn around. They saw that the US and its allies, I believe Australia was also participating in this, they weren't going to give up this base, and so, or at least not at a high cost. And so they just turned around and said, okay, well, we'll go and attack a different place. Um, Great thing about World War II is a lot of videos, a lot of footage around at this time. Let's take a look at the Battle of the Coral Sea. This video is a little exaggerated, I'm not going to lie, but it still shows us some valuable footage from the Battle of the Coral Sea. And in it, you'll see those examples of airplanes kind of flying out, battling each other, attacking battleships, the battleships never actually seeing each other. Okay, that's enough for me. Here is the Battle of the Coral Sea. So, as you saw in the video, Battle of the Coral Sea, super important in World War II. I mentioned Australians were fighting. This is a battle that is very important in like Australian history. It really saves Australia from being conquered by the Japanese. Sadly, like as the video also points out, it's not really well remembered in the U.S. Um, let's get out of here. Go back to our presentation. And as you saw, as I mentioned earlier, um, Japan is forced to turn around and try a different course of attack. And that brings us to the next battle. Let's let this load a few moments to the Battle of Midway. Okay, the Battle of Midway. A month later, after this, Japan says, okay, enough of this. We're going to send our best ships. We're going to send our best admiral, Admiral Yamamoto, in person to go land a second definitive blow against the United States. Again, Japan's goal here is not to invade the US. They don't want to engage the US for years and years and years. No, they just want a quick victory. And so they're sending everything that they have. Again, at Hawaii. Again, at the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. Midway is an island, as the name suggests, midway or halfway between the US and Japan in the Pacific. It is only about 600 miles away from Hawaii. And I say only 600 miles because really that's only about a 13-hour drive. And in the ship, you can cover that in about a day. And in the plane, an hour and a half. So it's actually pretty close. At this island, the United States basically holds off this second Japanese attempt to neutralize the United States. The way they did this was a little bit clever. They basically detected the Japanese ships, hung around, they didn't attack, they just stayed out of sight and waited until they saw all the Japanese airplanes take off. Once the Japanese airplanes took off to go look for the American ships, the Americans came in and attacked the undefended Japanese aircraft carriers and battleships. This is still a defensive victory. This is still the US playing defense. That's going to change in the next section. But before I even move on to that next section, I also would be wrong if I didn't mention what was happening inside of the United States as the US was starting to play defense against Japan. Because Japan and the United States declared war against each other, you did see a wave of anti-Japanese American sentiment or anti-Japanese American feelings develop in the US. And this was to start in February of 1942, the start of forced relocation of Japanese Americans. This is especially important for us here in Los Angeles and in California, because a lot of these camps were built on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. A lot of those Japanese Americans were forced from their homes along the West Coast, many of whom lived in Los Angeles. For example, some of you may know the town of San Pedro. Or San Pedro, depending on your pronunciation. That used to be a Japanese American community, right? Like that's where like you would find a very large number of Japanese Americans. Why is that not the case anymore? Japanese internment. A lot of these Japanese people, again, forced to move to these camps, internment camps, lost their businesses, lost their homes. And we know this is wrong. We know this is bad because the two reasons I usually cite are, well, what about German Americans? Where were the internment camps for German Americans? Where were the internment camps for Italian Americans? It was racism, right? The white Americans weren't going to be seen as being suspicious. The Asian Americans, though, were, suffering that racial discrimination. The second thing that I point out to show that we know that this is wrong, we know that this is a bad thing, is that in 1988, the United States president, Ronald Reagan, like the most famous Republican president after Abraham Lincoln, said, okay, this was wrong, and I'm going to deliver financial reparations. We're going to pay back the 100,000 surviving Japanese Americans the equivalent of money that they lost because of Japanese internment. So that's what's happening in the US as the war rages on in the Pacific. It's a bit of a long first half, so 3 questions for the CFU. Let's break it up here. So number one, true and false questions again. The Doolittle raid successfully destroyed multiple Japanese cities following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Number two, the Battle of the Coral Sea was fought mostly by battleships attacking each other directly. And three, the Battle of Midway was the first real offensive American victory in the Pacific. Take a few moments for CFU number one. All right, now we'll move on to the second half. This part should not be as long as the first half, but we have to describe what America's offensive strategy was. Now that we have successfully defended American bases, Allied bases, Australia, the entire continent and country of Australia from the Japanese, it's time to go on the offensive. There's a lot of differing opinions on how the US should do this. There are a lot of differing opinions how the Allies should do this. There are literally hundreds of islands in the Pacific, many of which were controlled by Japan. Um, there were some people who said, we have to fight every single island. We have to invade every single island in order to protect ourselves from a Japanese attack, right? So we have to go in, we have to fight the Japanese in every single island. However, again, that is hundreds of islands. Who knows how long that could take? A U.S. general named, I'll check the name again right now, but there's this idea that, the better strategy is to do something called island hopping. Now, in island hopping, what you do is you take over the least well-defended island near you, okay? Now, you go out, you take over that poorly defended island. You can then use that poorly defended island that's now yours to hop, to land your planes, to land your ships, and look for the next poorly defended island, and then hop over to that island. And then from there, hop over to the next one, then hop over to the next one. So you see in this map, the strategy was basically going to be to hop from island to island to island, but only the important ones. Eventually with the goal of landing close enough to be able to attack Japan directly. Island number one. This is in November of 1942. Douglas MacArthur, by the way, the name of the general, the guy that actually MacArthur Park is named after in K-Town. I can't believe I blanked out on that one. But that takes us to the Battle of Guadalcanal. Island number one. The first offensive battle where the US and its allies, again in the Pacific, it was mostly Australia, decided to land on this island called Guadalcanal. Now, when the US enters, there's very little trouble actually landing. There's very little, they basically face no resistance. Like, if you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, and that like graphic opening scene where they're like the Americans and the British are landing on Normandy in Omaha Beach, and the Germans, the Nazis are just completely destroying the Americans as they land. This is the opposite of that. American forces land and there's no resistance, right? It was basically a trap. Japan basically wanted to lure American forces and Australian forces into Guadalcanal and then capture them. That didn't happen. What did happen was 6 extremely fierce months of fighting to take over this tiny little island in the middle of the Pacific. Some soldiers, there's one soldier who famously called this or described this as hell on earth. 1,600 Americans were killed, 4,000 were wounded, and about another 1,000 died of diseases that they caught on the island. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. However, let's look at the second statistic here. How many Japanese soldiers were killed? There were 36,000 Japanese soldiers on the island of Guadalcanal. 2/3 of them, 2 and 3 Japanese soldiers, or 24,000, died fighting against the United States and its allies in Guadalcanal. And this is setting a precedent. You are going to see something similar play out every single time the United States tries to hop onto a new island. This is famously captured in the series of movies. I mentioned Saving Private Ryan. Another movie that came out at the same time. I'm only mentioning this because a lot of you guys come into my office hours to talk about movies. But if you've watched Saving Private Ryan, if your parents let you watch that one, it's rated R. It's super graphic. The other movie that came out that same year about World War II is one called Thin Red Line, or The Thin Red Line. And it's kind of the opposite of Saving Private Ryan, right? Like Saving Private Ryan takes place in Europe, The Thin Red Line takes place in the Pacific. But it does a really good job of capturing just what this, quote, hell on earth would have looked like. While at the same time just showing like how beautiful the Pacific is, right? Like this is a tropical island, man. Like if it weren't for the dead soldiers on the beach, this could be a resort, right? This is tropical. This is beautiful. But amidst all this beauty, there's this horrendous war taking place between the United States and Japan. So that basically rounds out the lesson for today. Let's do our final check for understanding. True or false again. The American strategy of taking over only the most important islands was called island hopping. And 5, the first offensive Allied victory was the Battle of Guadalcanal. All right, that takes us to closing. Again, as I've mentioned a few times, we're in the World War II unit. I never really get to take time to really hang out in World War II and look at it in detail. But again, because this seems to be higher interest, we'll hang out here for a little bit. I've broken up this week's chapter into 2 parts. Today you'll be doing the second part. Part B, part 2 of Japan's Pacific campaign, going into more detail about the stuff that we mentioned. And again, just like before, you'll find that exit ticket embedded into assignment number 2. Feel free to send me any questions you might have via email, or please make use of our office hours. Hopefully I'll get to see some of you soon via office hours. But until then, take care, stay safe. And please stay healthy.